Thank you. Okay. So what I was just in the middle of explaining the nuance of the title. His name is Rabbi Mordechai Melanchik, and he writes many books. He writes books because he's a known personality. He's a known rabbinic individual. He's known to be Talmid Chacham who has a skill at addressing complicated contemporary problems that people in the Jewish community of Chicago are faced with. And he'll be approached by Jewish rabbinical community leaders to write a book on a given topic. So he writes many books, and they all start with the word Midarkei, because that could also spell his first name, Mordechai. He's a friend of mine. Oh. Yeah, so he was actually my shver, my father-in-law's chavrusa, when my father-in-law still lived in Chicago or in the suburbs of Chicago. When I was, a quote-unquote rabbinical intern at Adas Yeshurun, which was a fairly substantial Orthodox congregation in Chicago, he was the administrator. He ran a lot of their educational programming. He wasn't the senior rabbi. That was Rabbi Zeb Cohen, but a very important person in the life of that shul, and he still continues to be, is Rabbi Mordechai Melanchik. And he's a friend of mine. He's a contemporary. He's a little bit older than me. And Shalom Mordechai will actually occasionally spend a Shabbos or two with him. Um, he's a very fun guy. And so this actually was in response to a situation that they were dealing with in Chicago, and that is that Millennial Park. Are you familiar with Chicago at all? And some other. Okay, I just lost my microphone. I lost everything. Okay. Okay, this isn't good. That will change things. Okay, yes, now we're back. We're back. Okay, perfect. I got to change settings up here. Okay, so many of these, because if you're familiar with the history of Chicago, Chicago used to be a city, and then it was burnt down, and then they rebuilt the city. Well, they rebuilt a whole bunch of civic and facilities on top of old cemeteries. So every so often, when there's a major storm, a body will somehow appear in I think either in Lincoln Park or in Millennial Park. I don't remember where exactly it is. And it always became a question: what do Kohanim do in these locations, in these places? The Field Museum often has displays from Egypt that have mummies. Can Kohanim go inside the building? Like, what can they go? Can they go to a different wing? What are the restrictions that they have? What are the rules just overall in general? Provide something that's easy to understand, something that's palatable, something that can be digested by the masses. We need your help, Rabbi Melanchik, and he's the person who often responds to these kinds of requests. So he's a very fun guy. He does a ton of research, and for example, if you were to look in the back, with where you have all the figures, because he spent a lot of time. I'm not sure if you can see all the pictures that he's taken. We haven't necessarily covered all of them, but he actually has a picture there, which might, yeah, it's figure number 7. That's the cemetery right across the street from Telz Yeshiva, because there's a big tree that goes over the cemetery, and there are a lot of Bachrim who walk up and down that road. He spends time talking and dealing with, what do you do in these kinds of situations, and he actually references Foster and Central Park, which is right across the road from Tells. It's always the Kohanim are always walking on the other side of the road, so he spends a lot of time doing a ton of research. Also over here, note number 6, trees overhang from a Jewish cemetery, which is on Pratt Avenue in Lincolnwood. Yeah, I've been to that cemetery. I know exactly where that cemetery is. He can see, for those of you who are looking at this online over there, you can see the picture at home. He spends a lot of time just going through a lot of research, but it's also very focused on the practicalities of life in Chicago, which we can definitely learn from, because they're pretty universal. We don't have too many trees here, so I guess that's not super applicable for Calgary. But it's definitely something to be to give consideration to, especially as we do travel around. We're no longer sort of consigned to remaining in one city our entire lives. We do end up traveling and seeing other places. These are very important ideas, very important concepts, and he spends a lot of time giving very practical examples and answers as to how to negotiate many of these challenges. So let's go. Let's begin. So we're going to start and we're going to look at his introduction over here. The Jewish people are a holy nation. This status is a sign of the special closeness between the Jewish nation and the Creator. Because the Jewish nation is a holy nation, we are susceptible to various impurities and contaminations that do not affect other peoples. He's already laying some theological foundations here about what does it mean for there to wherever you find sanctity, wherever you find impurity, you also find sanctity. The idea is that where you have a greater potential for sanctity, it's in those locations where you also have a greater potential for impurity. So if we are a holy people, we're called upon to be holy people, and we have the potential to be holy, that means we also have greater potential to be impure or to be exposed to impurities that don't necessarily affect other people. So these are why some of these rules apply specifically to Jews and why some Jews more than other Jews, as opposed to being a universal truth about how everyone in the world should operate. Purity and impurity is very fine, it's very pinpointed at specific groups of people for very specific reasons. So it says tuma is the ritual contamination of impurity that can affect people, objects, foods, beverages. Tuma can come from dead animals and humans, or live humans who experience certain body irregularities. So you think, for example, of a tsaras. That's everybody's favorite example of a bodily impurity. There's something about the individual that marks them as being impure, and therefore there is a ritual requirement to separate and to purify. Tuma is a status that affects all Jews. No matter who you are, if you are a Jew, you are susceptible to becoming impure. In the times of the Beis Hamikdash, a person needed to and will need into the future when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, be aware of his status in relation to Tuma and Tahara. This is something that we have to be cognizant of in the future, and it was something that we had to be cognizant of in the past. A person, even a non-Kohen who is Tameh Mace, which means that he came in contact with the deceased, may not enter the Beis Hamikdash, bring a Korban Pesach, and if he is a Kohen, he may not eat Truma. Even in contemporary times, the laws of Tuma and Tahara have certain, though limited, applications. These laws are extremely relevant regarding Kohanim. It is these laws that this work will strive to elucidate. What he's saying is that the laws of purity and impurity apply to everybody. We are all susceptible to becoming impure. And likewise, there are also certain restrictions that we have when we are impure. Most of them are moot. Most of them are no longer in application as the temple no longer stands. But there are some circumstances and situations where these rules do come into effect, as we will go through, as we'll explain, and particularly with regards to Kohanim. Kohanim still have an obligation to observe certain rules and certain rituals of purity. The most stringent tuma, that is that of the tumas mes, which is tuma or impurity that is contracted through the through the deceased. It is in tuma that emanates from a corpse. Tumas mes, and he says this is what we're going to be discussing, and from this point on, we're just going to refer to generically as tuma or impurity, can be transferred from a corpse, from a deceased body, either by touching it, even if you don't move it, or moving it, even if you don't touch it. So if you think back to Monty Python, if you recall the gentleman who was collecting all the dead from the Black Plague, bring out your dead. That's right, exactly. So even if you don't come in contact with the deceased, you're rather just pushing a cart with a body in it, that leaves one subject to impurity. And also, he says, there's a third mechanism by which a person can become impure, and that is through being under the same roof, which is an ohel, which is a cover or a tent. These are the three ways by which the impurity of a dead body is contracted, is spread. let's continue. A person need not be aware that he has come in contact with a corpse in order to become Tameh Mace. He's Tameh even if no one knew of the existence of the corpse. Once a person becomes Tameh Mace, he remains Tameh until he undergoes a special purification process. Does anybody here know about the purification process? What is it that makes a person pure after they come in contact with the dead? It's it's a very famous, it's a very famous ritual. It's a very famous mitzvah. The red heifer. The red heifer, the red cow, the red female cow. That is the ashes of which we use to purify somebody after they've come in contact with the deceased. That's how we purify someone from coming in contact with the dead. Until we go through that process, the individual who came in contact with the dead, either through moving, either through touching, or through being under the same roof, that person remains in that state of impurity. And this is the crux. This is the most important line that we're probably going to read in the introduction anyways. Kohanim are prohibited from being in situations which make them tamei mes. A Kohen is not allowed to be in a situation where they're in contact with the source of the impurity, whether it's under the same roof, whether it's through moving it, or whether it's through touching it. Now, this is actually a fascinating discussion that the poskim get very, very involved with. And it is subject to a very large argument. If we cannot become pure until we go through this purification process, well, then let's imagine that a Kohen who didn't realize it, walked underneath the tree down on Central Avenue, Central Park, rather, excuse me, in Chicago, when you're going down Foster Avenue, right by Central Park. You walk under that tree, you are now under the tree. You have now shared an ohel with a grave. You're already impure. Well, now that you're already impure, you're impure. You can just go ahead and continue. Now you can go through take a tour and go on a walk through a cemetery. And in fact, there is one authority who says that once a Kohen is impure, they're not subject to this prohibition any longer. The prohibition is only about becoming impure. And once you're impure, once you're ready tameh, then there's no prohibition. That is the opinion of the Ravid, the person who wrote the strictures on the Rambam, on Maimonides. He is the only authority who is of this opinion. That seems to be the rabbinic consensus. That is, the rabbinic consensus rejects this opinion and says it's not so much about the contraction of the impurity, it's the act of contact that seems to be the prohibition. That seems to be what is forbidden. We're instructed that we have to conduct ourselves with an elevated level of sanctity, of kedusha. It's not about acquiring the impurity that we're concerned with, but it's how we conduct ourselves overall. And that seems to be how just about every single authority decides. The Ravid is the only person that I know of, at least also according to the author, it's on the footnotes here, that says that once you've been exposed, then now you've been inoculated. Now there's no longer an issue. Just about everybody seems to completely disagree with this point of view. Well, then let's take a look. Let's read this a little bit further. Kohanim are prohibited for being in situations that make them a tamei mes. This is written explicitly in the parsha of Emor el HaKohanim b'nei Aharon. Speak to the priests, the children of Aharon. For Amarta Oleim, and you will say to them, Lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. You shall not become impure through contact with a human body. If a Kohen disregards his kedushas kahuna, if a Kohen says, you know what, I'm joining the Chevra Kedisha anyways. I don't care about the Torah prohibition. I'm just going to go about and do my thing. He is ineligible to recite Birchas Kohanim, and he does not receive the first aliyah, nor does he receive any other benefits of the kahuna. A Kohen can sometimes, through their actions, through their behavior, through their choices, relieve themselves of their obligations of being a Kohen. They're definitely transgressing prohibitions here, and it's definitely not approved behavior. But when a Kohen makes a choice, and I will not abide by the rules that govern what it means to be a Kohen, well, then that person also loses all of the other things associated with being a Kohen. They don't duchen. They don't get the first aliyah. We don't give them preferences when it comes to Birchas Hamazon. It's not a good thing to do, and it's often very, very painful when a Kohen encounters this. Um, but the when a Kohen can choose to disregard the sanctity of their office, and when they do disregard the sanctity of their office is no longer their office. Um, However, they can very easily get it back once they say, "You know what? I'm quitting the Chevra Kadisha." You go to the rabbi and say, "I'm not doing that anymore." Then they're entitled to all of their privileges once again. It's not like it's a like they've been disqualified, barred for life from being the Kohen. Now, let's take a look at footnote um, number 8. I have it highlighted here. I did reference this before. It says even a Kohen who's already Tameh, the obligation to avoid Tumas Mace is still in effect. So what does that mean to say that a Kohen may attend the funerals of certain members of their immediate family? According to the Ravid, once they do that, they can go to any funeral. They are allowed to enter the cemetery for they're allowed to enter the cemetery for the for this would be a circumstance where they can actually enter the cemetery legally without any without any it's gonna why is this they changed the all the options there. I don't know what I'm doing any longer. I think I want this. Okay, and it's not giving that to me. I want okay, here we go. No. Yeah, no kidding.
And you're talking about Chicago, maybe the Pope is doing something here now.
Maybe that could definitely be. I can't. Okay, that's what I need. Spotlight forever. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, it took me a little bit of time to find it. Now we found it. Okay, very good. So getting back to our discussion over here, a Kohen can find themselves entering into a cemetery in a way that's completely, perfectly legal and halachic, and they're not transgressing anything. Burying a family member, like a parent, a child, a sibling. And once they become, according to the Rav, and once they become impure, they can then re-enter that, right? They can re-enter the cemetery without there being any problem, without there being any challenge. But again, that is the opinion that is completely rejected by the overwhelming consensus of a rabbinic opinion, and that it's not about acquiring the impurity that's prohibited. It's the act of contact with the impurity. It's about how you conduct yourself overall. Now, the question that some of the authorities ask is, well, what about other kinds of impurity? Like, um, for example, I'm just trying to think, there are other impurities like, idolatry. Idols also have a form of impurity. We can imagine a circumstance where an individual might, come in contact with an idol. And that one becomes impure after coming in contact with an idol. We say that a Kohen, for example, should not work in a museum that doesn't have any mummies but does have idols. Would a Kohen be allowed to come in contact with those idols? Would be the question. There are some individuals who do believe that the prohibition against coming in contact with things that are impure is not just about coming in contact with the deceased, those who have passed away with corpses, with dead bodies. It's also a prohibition against come in contact with any kind of impurity. But the Maharsham, one of the great halachic authorities of the 18th century, wrote that perhaps that when we do find that there are references to such a practice, such a stringency that Kohanim would observe, that would be primarily in the days when the Beit HaMikdash stood, but nowadays we no longer have many of those. We're nowadays that we're no longer subject to that level of obligation, and we sort of fall back on specifically being concerned about coming in contact with the dead as the exclusive impurity that Kohanim have to reckon with and have to be careful not to expose themselves to. All right. Questions, comments, rebuttals? Okay. So let's continue. let's talk about what kind of Kohanim in this are in discussion here. Who are the Kohanim who are restricted from coming in contact with the deceased? So a Kohen, even a Baal Mum, a Kohen with a mum is a Kohen who is someone who, for example, perhaps was in an accident and had to have an arm amputated or something of the sort. Now, generally, Kohanim who have blemishes and have imperfections with bodily imperfections are not allowed to perform the temple service. One might think that they would be therefore permitted to come in contact with the deceased, but we find that that's actually not, in fact, the case. A Kohen is obligated to avoid coming in contact with the dead, um, even if they are a Baal Mum, even if they are ineligible to perform the temple service. Again, it's not about who's offering the sacrifices, rather it's about who has the sort of the title of being a Kohen. Another restriction here, perhaps this is a limiting restriction, is that only male Kohanim are prohibited from coming in contact with the dead. It's only male Kohanim. Women, like the daughters of Kohanim or the wives of Kohanim, are permitted to come in contact with the dead. This is derived from the pasuk that says, "Amarta livnei Aharon," to the sons of Aharon, which is exclusionary. It comes to exclude the daughters of Aharon, which again means to say that specifically men have this restriction, women do not. The Torah says, "Emor el HaKohanim b'nei Aharon ve'omarto alehem." So you have this doubling of the language. Say to the Kohanim, the children of Aaron, and you will say to them. So you have the verb here repeated twice. Speak to them. From the doubling of the verb of emor, of emor and ve'omarta, Chazal understand this to mean that children are also subject to this prohibition, but not in the way that you would think. It's not that a child is subject to a prohibition, because children in general, we say, are not subject to prohibitions. Children are, they're not deemed to be accountable for their behavior. That the legal system also operates with this way. We have a juvenile justice system because children do not make good choices. They can't be held accountable. Therefore, they can't be considered completely culpable for their behavior. Very often, they're victims of their own circumstances. What this comes to teach us is that adults in the lives of children should work to keep children or male children from coming in contact with the dead. Adults are cautioned to ensure that their children do not become tameh. This means that an adult may not cause a Kohen child to become tameh, and a father has an obligation to educate his child to maintain his kedusha. So there's two parts of this. A, we're not allowed to, bring a child to become tameh, a child of a male Kohen, and also parents have an obligation to educate their children. These are not the same. They're not the same obligation. So, for example, if I were walking down the street and I saw Yankee Cohen, little boy, walking into a cemetery because his ball, he's playing ball, the ball goes into the cemetery, he walks in there, I'm not necessarily obligated to stop him from entering the cemetery. I'm not allowed to tell him to go into the cemetery, but I'm not obligated to stop him. His parents, who have an obligation to educate him, do have an obligation to stop him. And generally, we say, well, we all have sort of communal obligations one to another, but the obligation to stop the child stems from a different obligation than actually instructing the child to go in. I have an obligation not to introduce impurity to this child. It's a different obligation to educate the child. But they are both part and parcel of how we conduct ourselves with regards to Kohanim who are children. I remember, so when I was a kid, when I was going to school in Toronto, in elementary school, our school actually shared its building with a very large, substantial congregation. And when, it is unusual for a body to be brought into a shul for a funeral, but it does occasionally happen. I remember it happening here once or twice, not often, but it does happen. I remember that the children, the Kohanim, my classmates who were Kohanim, would be summoned to the office and told that they had to leave the building, and the teacher would go outside and go play with them in the playground for the extent of the funeral. Was there an obligation of the school to do that? Yeah, probably, because schools are charged by the parents to educate their kids. So therefore, the obligation to educate the child was there. The shul possibly had the obligation not to bring the body in if there were going to be children there. Again, stemming from a different prohibition. Again, we're dealing with two different imperatives here. One is to educate, and the other one is to prevent. The other one is to not introduce impurity to a child. But once the body was brought in, this other obligation about education came into effect, and the children were told to leave. I could just imagine. I don't remember the kids doing this, but I can very imagine them being very thankful for the funeral. Great, somebody passed away. I get to skip class. I'm off from the test. There was a movie I saw a trailer for when I was a kid where it was about the Blitz. And I think one of the kids, you see these kids running out of school screaming, "Thank you, Hitler." They were able to get out of school. I don't remember what the movie that was, but I do remember that line of being very puzzled by it. Anywho, okay, so then what do you do about a pregnant wife of a Kohen? What do you do if you're not allowed to introduce impurities to your kids? What do you do? A Kohen's pregnant wife is permitted to enter an ohel hames. A pregnant woman is allowed to, for example, go into a hospital, even if she knows that there are dead bodies in the hospital, there are bodies in the morgue. A Kohenes, a wife of a Kohen, is allowed to enter into the hospital. Why is that? If we say that we're prohibited from introducing impurity to our children, why is it that she's allowed to enter into the hospital? So the Rokeach, interesting individual. The Rokeach was a Rishon. He was a medieval authority. He was from Germany. He was from the city of Worms. He was also known as the Romi Garmiza. Garmias is the old German name for worms. He was from the Hasidei Ashkenaz, which is a group of rabbis who were particularly focused on matters of purity and impurity, and were obsessed with tefillah, with prayer and numerology. A very, very interesting movement within Ashkenazi Jewry that were called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, not the Hasidim that we're familiar with as a medieval movement. But he wrote a halachic work, and he wrote as follows. He explained that there is a sfek sveka, which is a double doubt that permits the woman to enter into the hospital even while she's pregnant. The child, may be a girl, may be a boy. So that's question number one. And even if we say that the child is male, who says that the child is going to be carried to full term and that the baby will ultimately be born as a live, healthy male new baby boy Kohen? So that is what's called a sfek sveka, a double doubt whether or not there's even a question here, whether or not there's even a prohibition. And so as a result, he says she is allowed to enter the hospital to get that ultrasound or to do whatever it is that needs to be done. Now, you can quibble with either one of these doubts. I mean, most pregnant women do carry to full term. Most of the time, they do give birth to healthy babies, and so therefore, is there really a double doubt here? Is there really a possibility? Is that really a legitimate, what we call possible outcome that doesn't present a problem? The Chassam Sofer essentially says there's so many other reasons as to why we can allow, or why this isn't a problem, and as a result, there's no issue here. And in fact, you'll actually take a look at the text over here is dealing more specifically with questions of whether or not the woman is allowed to go to a funeral, which is obviated because many people pregnant women generally, the generally accepted practice is that pregnant women do not go to funerals. So it pretty much obviates the whole problem to begin with, at least from the perspective of the question that's being discussed over here. But in general, we do say that there's no problem for a pregnant woman to come in contact with the mace, even should she give birth to a baby boy. In most cases, I'm going to the hospital, especially to seek medical attention is a necessity for the child, and it can even be a question of sakana, a dangerous or potential outcome that is hazardous to the chances that the child will be born as a viable infant unless they go to the hospital in most of these cases. So we definitely do not place any kind of restrictions on a woman going to a hospital. And in general, we say that a woman does not have a problem even going to a funeral, even going to even in any, maybe even going to a museum would be permitted, because we're not particularly worried or concerned about a child in utero becoming impure. It doesn't seem to be a legitimate concern, legitimate worry overall. So we're not concerned about pregnant women, essentially what we mean to say. Not that we're not concerned. We are concerned about pregnant women, but at least when it comes to coming in contact with the dead. Okay, we'll go a little bit further here. It says non-Kohanim. Although a non-Kohen is not prohibited from becoming Tameh, one is not allowed to make a Kohen Tameh. To do so would violate the prohibition of Lifnei Iver, right? That means I can't trick a Kohen into coming into a shul for a funeral. Or I can't trick a Kohen into coming to by having tried to lead them to go underneath the bough of the tree that hangs over a grave. We'll talk about that soon. We'll get to all these cases that where we find that impurity is contracted or impurity is broadcasted. We'll talk about all these cases, but in general, a non-Kohen is, while not themselves prohibited from becoming impure, they have no prohibition. We're not allowed to make a Kohen. We're not allowed to make a Kohen impure. Again, that would violate Lifnei Iver, which is placing a stumbling block before the blind. A non-Kohen is also obligated to keep a Kohen away from a tumas mace. A non-Kohen must be careful not to bring a Kohen child or infant into a place where they would come in contact with the mace. So that would be, for example, like taking a Kohen child into to see the Egyptian exhibit at a museum where there will be mummies. One must wake a sleeping Kohen, even if he is. One must wake a sleeping Kohen if he is in an ohel mace and inform him that he has to leave. So if we have that kid who's fallen asleep in class, is what sometimes happens, and the funeral takes place, there is an obligation to wake that child up and have them leave just as much as an adult. All right, this is a good place to stop. We'll conclude. We'll stop here. We'll continue next week from page 8, transmission of tuma, transmission of impurity. And again, I'm open to questions, comments, or rebuttals. Go ahead.